Hey everybody, Michael Crump back here again, and today I want to talk about this project, which is the Picoboot. And as it states right here on the page, this is an IPL replacement mod chip for the Nintendo GameCube. So it's going to allow you to run homebrew applications and much more on your GameCube with simply installing this $4 Raspberry Pi Pico board. Now, this video is more of a tips, tricks, and techniques on using that board as I just completed my installation. This isn't going to be a video where I show you, 30 minutes worth of me soldering points together. It's more of a tips and tricks as I just mentioned. So let's just go ahead and let's get started with what the tools are that you're going to need in order to do this project. So one of the very first things that you're going to need besides a Nintendo GameCube is you're going to need a way to open the 4 security screws that's on the back. Now, I bought this kit a while back. This is just an iFixit kit, but it comes with the necessary bits that the Nintendo uses for their security screw. And to be a bit more specific, it's actually this 4.5 Gamebit driver that is needed. Now, you don't have to spend a whole bunch of money as this iFixit kit was fairly expensive, but you can go to Amazon or something like that and do a search for 4.5 Gamebit driver, and you should be able to buy a driver for a couple of bucks that allows you to get into the GameCube much easier. And the next thing that you will need is going to be a soldering iron as well as some solder. So this is one that I have used on a number of projects over the last couple of years. And actually, this is just a standard Radio Shack soldering iron. There's nothing really that interesting about this. If I were to get one today, I probably would buy one a little bit more professional, but since I only do mods that require solder from time to time, this has been good enough for me. And then I just have some standard rosin core solder. And again, you can pick this up absolutely anywhere. And I typically like a thinner wire because most of the electronics that I've been dealing with in mods has been very small connection points. Then you're going to need some sort of wire to hook up between the console motherboard and the Raspberry Pi Pico chip. In this example, I bought this wire, which is from Strive Day, and this is 28 AWG. You can get a couple of other strengths of that, and when you open up the container, this is what it looks like. One of the reasons that I like this wire is that it's very easy to work with, it's very flexible, as well as it's easy when you need to come in here and maybe clip off this end right here for a connection point. For the most part, I haven't really needed to do anything outside of just pull on it in order for it to detach and leave the wires exposed. Again, I'll leave a link to exactly the one I bought into the description below. Next up, I would recommend getting some sort of rosin paste flux if the solder that you're using doesn't already have rosin included in it. So I bought this a little while back, and I did wind up using this even though the solder I had some rosin in it. And I'll kind of go into that in just a few moments, but this was fairly inexpensive, and obviously the primary benefit of using flux is that it helps fuse the metals together. And you will, of course, need to get a Raspberry Pi Pico. So this is how it came to me. They did come inside of a 2-pack. And so I did order these directly from Amazon versus from the Raspberry Pi Foundation, primarily because with Raspberry Pi and that foundation, they wanted to charge a lot of money for shipping versus I was able to get both of these for right around $14, which equates to about $7 a piece. versus if I had have bought these for $4 off of the Raspberry Pi site and then added in shipping cost. For the most part, it was going to be somewhere around the same, maybe a little bit more expensive, and I was going to have to wait in order for it to get to me for several extra days. So I just went ahead and I got these on Amazon. Now, these do not come with the micro USB cable. Thankfully, I have tons of those around the house, so hopefully you do as well. And the main thing that I want to call out here is that when you do start to program these, you will need to hold down this boot select button as you plug this in to your computer in order for it to show up as a removable drive in order to place the files on it, which we'll cover in just a little bit. And like I stated, these are very small. So this is my hand, and I'm trying to show a bit of a comparison of the size. They're definitely not as big as you may think that they are. And then obviously on the back side, it has the layout of the pins that you're going to be soldering to, which we'll cover that in just a moment as well. And then finally, you're going to want a way that you can load your games off of an SD card. So one of the primary benefits of using Picoboot is to pair it with a homebrew application that's just called Swiss. And so Swiss will allow you to run your games off of an SD card. For example, you can also run them off of a DVD-R, but you definitely want to take advantage of using an SD card. So in this example, since I am using a DOL 101 console, it was easier for me just to get the Gecko SD, which is this memory card right here. So you'll see it is called WISD memory card. And I paired it with a SD card that I just had around the house. Obviously, it has now been replaced with a SanDisk 128 gigabyte card. And on the back of this, it does give you a little bit more information, but for the most part, we don't really need any of that because we're going to simply just be able to load our ISO images of our GameCube games onto the SD card and then put it directly into the bottom of the memory adapter as shown here. So once connected, it will look like this. And don't be alarmed with it sticking out a little bit. That's just the way that it's going to work. And if you have a DOL 001 console, well, you don't have to actually use the memory card. You can simply pick up one of these SD2, SP2 cards, and you would plug this into the serial port number 2, which is on the bottom of your console. These are very inexpensive. They're absolutely everywhere. You can grab these from AliExpress and a number of other places. And once this is fitted into your console, again in serial port 2, only for the DOL 001 consoles, it looks nice and neat, and you can access the SD card from the very bottom of your GameCube. Okay, and so that's pretty much going to do it for the tools that is required in order to do this modification. Obviously, the other thing that you should already have is a standard screwdriver and maybe some tape to secure the mod. Let's go ahead now and let's review the wiki page on the installation guide. Okay, so to begin with, it does state right here, there is this word of caution. It says there are a lot of botched installation pictures all over the internet. Don't attempt the installation until you have enough soldering experience. You won't be able to magically do it after watching one video on YouTube. It requires actual practice. So it says to try it on scrap electronics first. And for the most part, that's exactly what I've done. Right here, I have got a extra PlayStation 3 motherboard that actually has some problems, but I've been using that to practice my soldering for a number of years now, actually. And so I would suggest, if you were to do this, to definitely try this on some electronics that you already own first. The points are very small, at least they're small in my opinion, not for people that probably do this a lot more often than I do, but it does require some patience and a little bit of skill. But keep in mind that if I did it, you can do it too. Okay, and for the prerequisites, we did cover that. Again, the note here is you need a soldering iron, soldering wire, flux, and 26 AWG and 28 AWG wires. Obviously, I was using a 28 AWG wire for all 5 of the connection points that was needed, but there is some recommendations on where you might want to use 26 and 28. I simply didn't do it that way simply because I didn't want to buy any more wire for this mod. He does recommend a T12 soldering station, which I would absolutely agree would be a really nice thing to have. You can come over here to Amazon, and this is the station, and this is what it looks like. Obviously, being able to do things like adjust the temperature a little bit better would be a nice thing to have. So I would recommend, if you don't have a soldering iron and you want to do a lot more projects like this, it's probably wise to go ahead and invest in a solid soldering station. The next few things is the Raspberry Pi Pico, which we already covered. You can get knockoffs of the Raspberry Pi Pico from AliExpress, but I absolutely wouldn't. I would get the real thing that came from the foundation. And again, there is the SD Gecko that I covered and showed you what that looked like for DOL 101, or the SD2 SP2 for the DOL 001. Next, again, you will need a FAT32 or exFAT formatted SD card. Next, it talks about flashing the Raspberry Pi Pico board. So it says go to the latest release page, and I downloaded this file right here, which was just picoboot.uf2, and it says connect the Raspberry Pi Pico board to your computer while holding boot cell button pressed. You'll see that there is a mass storage device that shows up, and you're just going to simply drag and drop the file to that device. You will see a green LED if it was programmed correctly, and then you are completely done with the Pico. So just unplug it and get it ready for being installed into the GameCube. And so the operating system for the Raspberry Pi Pico lives on the Pico board, whereas the homebrew applications and the ISO images of the games lives on the SD card. And so it states that you should format your SD card to FAT32 or exFAT and download the latest Swiss release from here. So if we go here and we open this up and you scroll down, right there is where Swiss is at. So you would just simply download this. You will have a folder in here called DOL, and what you're going to want to do is to extract this file out and then just rename it IPL.dol. Now, as an extra bonus, if you also copy this file to the root of your SD card again and name it IGR.dol, well, then you can turn on in-game reset inside of the Swiss options in order to reset back to Swiss while you're inside of a game, which makes it very handy because you don't have to get up in order to change the game that you're currently playing. And then once you do that, the only other thing that you're really going to need is to make sure that the games that you put on your SD card are in the ISO format. So NKit, GCM, none of those will work. Put them as a .iso file onto the SD card. And now we get into the hardware installation. So there is this very handy guide here, but when I first went to this guide, I really could not see exactly what was going on inside of the image. And if you click on it, you still can't really see. Now, there is a way to obviously come back to the root of Picoboot, go into Assets, and then take a look at one of the wiring diagrams here. And this is the large version of it. So you would be able to see and understand what the pins are quite easily versus trying to look at it through that other image. Now, we're going to go back a couple of pages here because I wanted to cover some of the text that was down here at the end. So the first one that it says is that wire length and diameter plays a huge role. Keep the wires as short as possible. So around 4 inches is a sweet spot. It says anything longer can result in a no video issue and doesn't work reliably. It says use high quality 28 AWG cables for data and 26 for 3.3 and ground. Now, I did this the wrong way. I did this with longer wires, and let me show you those. This is how I originally wired it up. And as you can see here, these wires that are coming out of it are a lot longer than the recommended 4 inches that was stated in the documentation. So once I wired all of this up and I decided to turn on my television or power on the GameCube, what did I see? No signal. I can tell you from my own experience that if the cables are too long, you will get no signal or no video output. And then the other point that it had here was that it's very easy to overheat the GameCube motherboard in real pads. It happens if you hold your soldering iron for too long. Using Flux, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, makes soldering much easier. If you're using stranded wire, twist the ends first and then tin with solder before soldering to the motherboard. Use some flux and leaded solder on the points you will be soldering wires to in a moment. Okay, so let's go ahead now and let's review the installation diagram. And we're going to go into Assets. I'm going to go to the wiring diagram, and I'm just going to press the download button here. And now I would be able to zoom in or to zoom out of it. Again, I'm just using Chrome. So there is 2 main models of the GameCube. There is the DLL-001 or the DLL-101. This is obviously the oldest version, and the 101 is the newest version. So with each of these, there is only 5 points that you're going to need to solder to, and it is very much dependent upon the model. If you want to know which model that you've got, all you need to do is simply turn over your GameCube and you'll be able to see which model it is. Now, the Raspberry Pi Pico, as you see here, this is going to be identical regardless if you're using the DAL-001 or the DAL-101. Now, what I'm going to do in my example is I'm going to show you the DAL-101, which was what I had. Now, this one's a bit more complicated because you have to solder to the front of the motherboard as well as you have to solder to the back of the motherboard. Also, you have to use the Gecko SD in order to load games off of an SD card versus using the SD2 SP2 that you can use on the 001 console. So if I were looking for a GameCube for this mod, I would gladly pick the DOL-001. But since I picked up my GameCube that I used for this for $20 at a thrift store, I wasn't able to pick between the 001 or the 101. And so the model that I got again was the 101. So in order to get this set up, I need to zoom in to this part of the diagram. And here is the connection points that we're going to need to do on the front of the console. So here is the ground. These two need to be bridged together. Here is the GP5, and then over here is the 3v3. So let's look at how I did it. Okay, so here is the front side of my motherboard. I went ahead and I put some flux in here, and then after that, I went ahead and I tinned the points with some solder and followed the diagram and started wiring up the points. And it looked a little bit like this once I finished up. So obviously these two pins were ground together, so I just put some solder in between them. There is the ground wire. Here is the 3.3 volt wire, which connects to this pin right here. Again, you will need to be very careful to make sure that the solder doesn't flow over into any of the other pins, or there will be a problem. And then finally, this green wire, simply because I didn't have one that matched the diagram, comes over to this point right here, which is the GP5. And I did just use a piece of tape to kind of hold these wires down. Obviously, it would be best if you had some sort of thermal tape, but again, I didn't want to buy an additional thing in order to complete this mod. So I just used some regular tape, and here is a bit of a close-up once it was complete. Again, not the absolute best soldering job, but at least good enough to make this mod work. And so if you look at the two diagrams together, again, this was ground, and there is what my ground looks like. GP5 was pink in their example, and it's going to be green in mine. And then finally 3v3 was simply my red, and there is 3v3 connected. Okay, so now we need to switch over and we need to do the back. So here is the back of the motherboard, and keep in mind that these pins are very small, but again, with patience, you should be able to complete the project. And so once I had everything wired up, you can see the yellow here is GP6 and 7, as well as GP4 is up here at the top in blue. Just like in the previous example, I did put some tape on top of this in order to ensure that these pins weren't moved in case there was some sort of tug on these wires. And there is another additional close-up of that connection. And now one thing you will want to make sure that you do is that facing the controller, so here is the memory ports, and here is where the audio video hookup is. You want to make sure that as you're wiring these in, that you make sure that the cable is going towards the left side. And the reason for that will be explained in just a moment. But here is an image of once I was able to get everything soldered from the front and from the back. And there's a shot of what the back looked like and how I routed the cables. And if you have a DOL 101, you will need to make a little space here for the cables on the back of the motherboard, the two cables, in order for them to be able to come back out. So if you have the first revision or the DOL 001, you don't have to worry about that because all the cables are on the top of the motherboard. But in my example, since I had the DOL 101, I needed to make a little bit of space for those wires to come out from the back side of the motherboard. And I was able to do this just right here. You could use a butter knife or something of that nature in order to open that space. And so here is what it looks like once you set the motherboard back down. You can see the two wires that we have here, they are not being pinched or obstructed in any way. And here is a top view of the motherboard. And then once you get your wires routed, you will want to go ahead and put back on the heatsink as I did here. There is 6 screws that you will need to put back into the console. I would go ahead and put on the front of the console, which is where the memory cards are, as well as the controller port, by just simply plugging this wire back into the front. And then you're going to need to put the optical drive back in and then start screwing in these screws, these 3 right here, these 4 in the back, and then these 5 on the side, and then these 4 in the front. But before you do that, You will want to make a slight modification to the casing in order for these wires right here in order to fit through. So by default, this is what the optical drive looks like. And it's really this piece right here that you're going to want to at least cut somewhere around here in order to feed those 5 cables back through. So in my instance, what I did was I simply made a cut right here as shown in this example. That way my wires were able to feed back through. It doesn't really mess with the functionality of the GameCube, and I think it's pretty safe to go ahead and remove it. And then once you put the optical drive back on there, your wires are able to feed through. There is another shot of the wires coming through. And so once you put the screws for the optical drive, you can go ahead and place in your fan if you would like to, and you can go ahead and secure the fan with a couple of screws here. Don't forget to plug this wire back in to the fan. And then you're going to have your 5 remaining wires that you're going to need to hook up to your Pico board. And for the Pico board itself, I simply followed this instruction which came with the wiring diagram. So I placed it to ground, to my 3v3, GP4 and GP5, and then finally GP6 and 7 will need to be bridged together. One of the ways that I did that was that when I cut the wire, I made it long enough that it would go through the hole here and then go through the other hole. And then when I put some solder on this right here, it bridged them both together. But for the Pico, it's very simple in order to get those wires connected and soldered because the board is designed for that. So it made it a lot easier to get that to work. And once I had those wires soldered together, this is what the Raspberry Pi Pico looked like. And you can see there is a green LED when it is powered on. Now, in my opinion, the best place to put this is right beside the fan with the USB port facing upwards. And that's primarily because if you ever want to update this again, well, it's just going to be simply a matter of unscrewing the top case or unscrewing the case and then plugging in a micro USB cable into the top of the Pico and reprogramming it. And if you would like to, you can use some sort of tape to secure that here, which is what I eventually did. And then I went ahead and I gave it a shot without the case on there, and I was presented with Swiss version 0.6, which at the time of this recording was the latest version, and it picked up the games that I was currently installed to my SD card. And here's just a quick shot of me playing Wave Race, and it worked perfectly fine. And then I went ahead and I put everything back together again, and my GameCube looks as if it had never been modified. And then that just about does it for the Picoboot mod. So if you scroll back up, there is a troubleshooting tips in case somebody is having some additional problems. So my console boots to the vanilla GameCube menu, and it gives some additional information about why that is happening, as well as the console is running, but it doesn't display anything on the screen, which is usually because of the wires being too long. And then the power light comes off shortly after hitting the power button. So if you have any of these issues, then more than likely these tips will help you resolve them. And then finally, for updating Picoboot, it says in order to update it, you basically just need the micro USB cable and the Raspberry Pi Pico board inside your console. So you would go and grab the latest release off of the releases page, hold down the boot select button, and connect the USB cable on your computer, and then copy the new Picoboot.uf2 to that device, and it automatically ejects itself once it is finished writing the firmware, and then disconnect the USB cable and test your console. Now it does state right here that due to the current Picoboot wiring method, you should desolder the 3.3 volt wire for an update. This is done to prevent supplying 3.3 volts to the console, which results in overloading the power regulator on the Pico board. It'll get very hot if you don't desolder the wire. If you do it quickly enough, it shouldn't do any harm to the Pico, but it's recommended to just desolder the wire and resolder it once you're done updating. So I haven't had to update mine just yet, but when I do, I will probably desolder the 3.3 volt wire since the instructions say to do that. Well, that is going to do it for this one. I hope these tips and tricks on the Picoboot is somewhat helpful. I know there's a million different videos that's out there that shows people how they were disassembling and reassembling the GameCube, as well as a 20-30 minute video of just soldering those points together. I wanted to try to combine this into just really tips, tricks, and techniques in order for you to be successful with the Picoboot, since I just recently did this myself. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Michael, out!